Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. It's lovely to have you here. I must say this feels a little bit different to me. As Natalie mentioned, there's a few tech issues, so unfortunately I can't put it on actual slideshow view because you guys couldn't see it, and I also can't see the chat. So I have got a couple of points where I did ask for some interaction. We'll just have to see how that goes because, like I say, I can't see that. But again, thank you for joining us. I know how busy life is in early years, so I do appreciate you guys taking the time to join us here tonight. Whether you're a childminder or anyone who works in early years, I hope you leave today with some ideas and things that you can take straight back to your own setting. So the next one. Before we begin, I'd like to ask you all to do something for me. So for the next 45 minutes, I'd like you to try and look at the world a little bit differently through the eyes of a child. As adults, we're very good at recognizing what things are. We see a cardboard tube, a pine cone, a cork, and we immediately give it a label. It's a tube, it's a pine cone, it's a cork. But children don't do that. Instead, they ask a completely different question. They ask, what could this become? And I think that that tiny shift in thinking is sometimes at the heart of everything that we're going to explore today, because loose parts aren't just collecting interesting objects, they're about creating opportunities, opportunities to think, to imagine, to problem solve, collaborate, and create. So throughout today's webinar, I'm going to share some research that underpins this approach, but I'll also share lots of examples from my own practice because for me, that's where the real theory really comes to life. Research helps us to understand why things work, but it's the children who show us how that actually looks. And more than anything, I hope you leave today looking at everyday objects around you in a completely different way. Because sometimes the richest learning doesn't come from buying something new, it comes from seeing things with fresh eyes. So, before we begin, I had done this as a little challenge. So, on the screen, you'll see an everyday object. It's nothing particularly expensive. It's not something that lights up or makes a noise. In fact, so it's something you might just walk past or even throw away. But I'd love you to pop into the chat what you think these can become. What's the first thing that you think when you see this object? There's no right or wrong answer. Don't overthink it. Just write the first thing that's popping into your head. And Natalie, I'm just going to have to ask your help there because I can't see anything that comes through.
So we've got
So
bird feeder, tree,
that's the right one.
Christmas tree.
Yeah.
That's the three that we've got up to now. Christmas decorations.
Oh, very Christmassy theme coming along then. And whatever it is that you see, it's fascinating that we can all look at the same object and yet imagine completely different possibilities. Some of you might look at something and see a rocket or pirate treasure or a musical instrument, or in this case, Christmas things. But objects don't change, but our thinking has. So now imagine a room full of children doing exactly the same thing. A room filled with what seem like normal everyday objects or even unusual things if maybe there's certain things that you're not familiar with or don't see very often, but every child will bring their own experience, their own ideas and their own imagination. So every child will create something slightly different or imagine something slightly different. And I think that's one of the things that I find so magical about loose parts, because they don't tell children what to think. They're inviting children to do that thinking themselves. And I think that's a really important distinction. So as we move through today's webinar, I'd like to keep coming back to that one simple question. What could this become? Because I genuinely think that's one of the most powerful questions we can ask ourselves when we're planning environments. One of the things that I've noticed over the years is that adults obviously look at play very differently to children. As adults, we tend to see a finished product. Quite often we like certainty. We like knowing what something is supposed to become. Children, on the other hand, are much more interested in the journey. I remember putting out a cardboard box one day. In fact, there ended up being a couple of cardboard boxes because we'd had a delivery. I hadn't planned anything around it. I hadn't painted it or turned it into anything or brought in other objects to create something else. I'd simply put it down to see what would happen. And within minutes, it had become a pirate ship. There was a cave. Someone had decided one was a post box and was posting lots of pine cones. Probably noticed a theme here. We're near woodlands and I have a lot of pine cones through a hole in the top. And before long, it had become a rocket that was heading to the moon. The box hadn't changed, but the children's thinking had. And I think that's such an important reminder for us as adults that sometimes we work incredibly hard creating exciting activities because we want children to learn. But what if sometimes the richest learning's happening when we're stepping back and simply providing an opportunity? Loose parts don't provide the imagination, the children do. Loose parts simply give the imagination somewhere to grow. So I did have a little poll here about how confident people are about using loose parts. So before we go any further, I'd love to get a feel for who's joining me today, just so I can try and tweak it as much as I can around the people that are on this webinar today. So you'll see a little poll on your screen with some numbers asking how confident you currently feel about using loose parts. Please just pop a number into the chat. Please don't worry if you're completely new to it. Equally, if you've been using loose parts for many years, that's wonderful too. It's just so we get a bit of a feel about who and where you're at. Sorry, Natalie, again, I'm going to need
Yeah,
your
that's
help
fine.
there with
We've got
that.
3 number 2s and 3 number 3s at the moment.
Okay, excellent. So it sounds like there's a couple of you that are either getting started or getting a bit more confident about using loose parts. And that, again, that's a wonderful things about early years is that we're all constantly learning. I've been doing this for a long time and the children still surprise me every single week, in fact, every single day. They make me rethink things and challenge my assumptions, and they remind me not to underestimate what they're capable of. So, wherever you all are on your journey with loose parts, I hope today's session gives you a little something new to think about or to reflect on. So, let's get down to it. What actually are loose parts? The official definition tells us that they're materials that can be moved, combined, redesigned, lined up, taken apart, and put together in multiple ways. Now, that's absolutely true, but personally, I think there's a much simpler way about thinking about them. For me, loose parts are resources without an agenda. It links back into that open-ended play. They don't arrive with instructions. They don't tell children how they're supposed to be used. They don't have only one correct outcome. A pine cone does not mind if one day it's a hedgehog today and an ice cream tomorrow, or a Christmas tree. A cardboard tube is just as happy being a pair of binoculars as it is being a marble run or a tunnel for dinosaurs. The possibilities belong entirely to the child. And that's actually quite rare in a world that has so many toys that are already decided what they're going to be. Please don't misunderstand me though. I'm certainly not saying that traditional toys don't have a place. They absolutely do. But loose parts offer something a little bit different. They hand the creativity back to the child. And instead of asking children to follow somebody else's idea, they invite them to create their own. And I think that's something really worth protecting. Please bear with me 1 second. I'm just going to have a quick drink. Okay. So, interestingly, this idea isn't new at all. In fact, it dates back more than 50 years. In 1971, an architect called Simon Nicholson shared what became known as the theory of loose parts. What I find really fascinating is he wasn't specifically writing about early years. He was thinking much more broadly about environments and creativity. And one sentence from his work has stayed with me ever since I first read it. And he suggested that a degree of inventiveness, creativity, and discovery is directly related to the number and kind of variables in the environment. Now, I don't know about you, but I absolutely love that word, variables, because that's exactly what loose parts are. They can be moved, combined, stacked, balanced, connected, taken apart, and put back together. Every tiny change is creating another opportunity for children to think. And isn't that what we want? We don't simply want children to know all the answers. Let's face it, we don't. We want them to be able to become confident thinkers, willing to test their ideas, make mistakes, and try again. So when I first came across Nicholson's work, I put into words something I'd already been noticing within my practice, that the richest learning, wasn't always happening with the most expensive resources, but it was happening where children had the greatest freedom to explore. Um, I'd like to stay with Simon Nicholson just for a few more moments because I think his theory is incredibly relevant to the way that we are thinking about in early years today. Sometimes people hear the words theory of loose parts and assume it's about putting more objects into an environment, but I actually think it's much deeper than that. For me, Nicholson wasn't really just talking about resources. He was talking more about possibilities. And think about it this way. Imagine I gave every child in a room exactly the same colouring sheet and exactly the same four crayons. We'd probably end up with lots of lovely pictures, but they'd all have fairly similar outcomes because the possibilities have already been narrowed. Now, imagine I simply placed a basket of simple objects or interesting objects in the middle of a room, maybe some shells, pebbles, wooden rings, corks, sticks, a bit of fabric. Suddenly, there's not just one outcome, but there might be 20 different outcomes or 200. And that's because the environment isn't telling the children what to do, it's asking them a question. What do you think? What could you create? What might happen if? I often think that's one of the greatest gifts we can give children because we currently live in a world where they're so often given answers. These parts can give them permission to ask questions instead. So when Nicholson talked about environments rich in variables, I don't think he necessarily meant environments that were busy or cluttered. I think he meant the environments that invite curiosity. And curiosity is incredibly powerful because curious children naturally begin investigating, experimenting, and problem solving. They don't need us to constantly motivate them because they're already motivated by the excitement of finding things out for themselves. So perhaps one of the questions we can reflect on from this is, does my environment answer children's questions? Or does it inspire them to ask more? And personally, I think that's quite a powerful question. And it's one I often come back to when I'm reviewing my own provision. So, loose parts don't have one purpose. I think one of the biggest misconceptions I hear is that people think they need a huge budget to create a loose parts environment. I'm sure we'll all have seen some of the beautiful loose parts that we can get from some of the large companies. And I will admit, I do have some, some of the smaller wrap pack pieces and things like that. But the good news is you don't need to do that. In fact, some of my favorite and the children's favorite loose parts haven't actually cost me anything at all. Personally, I think nature is probably one of the richest resources we have from a sustainability point of view and from an interest point of view. I find that some of the loose parts that my young ones often come back to are those natural resources, like the pine cones, as you've heard me talk about already, sticks, pebbles. Harrison, darling, oh, see daddy. Okay, bye, darling. Come on, thank you. Right, go on. Sorry. Just take him upstairs, please. Sorry about that. Pine cones, sticks, pebbles, shells, leaves, some of the seed heads, they're amazing. Every season can offer us something different. In autumn, we love collecting conkers, and they often become part of our provision for some time. In fact, we've still got a small collection of conkers left from autumn that have survived. Obviously, things like that, I just ask you to risk assess, obviously, for the children that you've got in your care. I often find myself coming back from a walk with pockets a little fuller than I left. I don't know if anyone else does that. We've been to the woodlands today and we all came back with some different types of fir cones and seeds that again they brought back to the provision, and a couple went home as well. Then we've got things like recycled materials. Again, we've talked about cardboard boxes, things like cardboard tubes, bottle tops, yogurt pots, bits of fabric offcuts, things that might otherwise end up in recycling can suddenly become incredibly valuable through the eyes of a child. Household items are wonderful too. Again, from being babies, we've used some of the wooden curtain rings, wooden spoons, baskets, whisks, old keys, napkin rings. They all have potential to be something entirely different and used in different ways for their play. Of course, there are the specialist leaves parts that we briefly mentioned, and things that you might not readily have available at home or within your local environment. But some of them, again, you can source. So we've got things like tyres in our back garden, cable reels. So tyres we asked for from our local garage who kindly delivered them for us. Cable reels I've asked on my local Facebook groups and had some of them kindly donated as well. So it doesn't always have to cost a lot. Obviously, there are the resources that do cost a bit more. Some of the specialist loose parts that are, colourful and things like that. And again, they have their place too. We use them for different things as well, but it doesn't have to cost lots. One thing I love about loose parts is they level the playing field. So whether you've got a small budget or a large one, every practitioner and every setting can create opportunities to use loose parts and for open-ended play. The secret isn't to having the perfect collection. The secret is offering enough variety for children to think creatively without overwhelming them. I always encourage practitioners to start small. You don't need hundreds of resources overnight. In fact, that might become a little overwhelming. Instead, begin with one basket. Observe what happens, notice what children are returning to, and build up your collection over time alongside children's interests. And again, what's available? If you've got woodlands near you or a beach, it might be easier for you to find some shells or to find some pine cones and sticks. You can bring them back to the setting and incorporate them within your play. Before I move on, I'd also like to mention something that's quite close to my heart, and that is large loose parts outdoors. Often when we hear the phrase loose parts, it's easy to picture those baskets of shells, those wooden curtain rings, those baskets of bottle tops and things. But loose parts can be so much bigger than that. If you think about those tyres, those wooden planks and crates, cable reels, tree stumps, guttering, large tubes or bamboo poles, those type of resources invite a completely different kind of play because children aren't just manipulating the objects with their hands anymore. They're moving them with their whole bodies. They're lifting, carrying, balancing, transporting, constructing, collaborating. And I think that's where outdoor play and loose parts become such a perfect partnership. The outdoors naturally offers children more space, more freedom, and more opportunities to think on that bigger, larger scale. I've watched children at my setting work together to move these heavy planks and carefully negotiate where the position of the tyres are going to go, and spend long periods of time redesigning obstacle courses because something wasn't quite working or because they had a different idea. And that's engineering, that's mathematics, that's communication, that's teamwork. And most importantly, it's meaningful. Nobody asked them to complete a task. They created one that was worth solving to them. So I often say that the loose parts and the outdoors belong together. As we've mentioned, nature is constantly changing. There isn't one correct way to explore a woodland, a garden, or a field. Every day looks a little bit different, and loose parts can fit beautifully into that ever-changing environment. Whether children are using their resources to create dens or build bridges over imaginary rivers or designing obstacle courses, or even just simply transporting logs from one side of the garden to the other, they're learning through that movement, that exploration, and that imagination. And sometimes I think the outdoors gives loose parts one of the things they need most, which is space. Space to build bigger, space to collaborate, space to test ideas, space to fail safely, and space to think. So we've talked a bit about why loose parts, or what loose parts are, sorry. But why do they have such a profound impact on children's learning? And I think the answer is actually quite simple. Loose parts don't do the thinking, the children do. So think for a moment about a toy that has one intended purpose. I mean, it can be fantastic, and I'm certainly not suggesting we're getting rid of these toys, but quite often a resource that already contains an idea. But loose parts are different, and they're handing that responsibility back to the child. So the children have to make decisions. We've briefly gone over some of the things that I might be thinking about. What am I going to build? How will I balance this? What happens if I add another block? That coming back to reflecting, why did that fall over? Or how could I make it stronger? And without even realizing it, they're becoming scientists, engineers, mathematicians, storytellers, and designers. And here's the really important thing. They're doing it because they want to, not because someone has asked them to, not because someone's told them they have to do it. I've often noticed that children will persevere for much longer with a challenge when they've discovered it themselves, rather than something that's been set for them. I mean, have you ever watched a child spend 20, 30 minutes trying to balance something or work out how to stop the ball from rolling away or get in a specific place? Nobody's told them to keep trying. Nobody's given them a sticker for persisting, but they're driven by something much more powerful. And it all comes back to that curiosity. Research consistently is telling us that active hands-on exploration supports children's cognitive development, their language, their executive functioning and problem-solving skills. But if I'm honest, I don't even need that research to convince me because I see it every single day. I see the children negotiating with each other and I hear them explain their thinking. I'm watching them adapt their ideas when something doesn't work, and I'm celebrating with them when they finally solve that problem. And that is real learning. And perhaps that's one of the reasons I feel quite passionately about loose parts, is because they remind us that learning doesn't always fit into a worksheet or a finished product or a perfectly planned activity. Sometimes it just looks like a child sitting on the floor surrounded by corks and cardboard tubes, completely absorbed in their idea. And that idea only exists within their own imagination. And personally, that is one of the most valuable moments that we have the privilege of witnessing. Again, one of the things that I've noticed over the years is that children's ideas often become bigger when we're taking those loose parts outside. I think there's something about being outside that removes those limitations, and children naturally begin working together and collaborating more because many of the resources can't be managed alone. and that invites others in. There's more negotiation and compromise, and adaptation, and more communication because they're physically active at the same time. They're engaging their minds and their bodies. And I genuinely believe that's something quite magical about combining loose parts and outdoor play. The two go hand in hand. Nature's providing endless inspiration, and loose parts provide endless possibility. And together, they're creating environments where children don't just play, they think, they imagine, they invent, and they thrive. The outdoors isn't just giving children more space to play, it's giving their ideas more space to grow. So, I'd just like you all to think back to a moment in your childhood. Can you all remember building a den out of blankets or turning your sofa into a pirate ship? Using sticks as magic wands or swords, or to mix your potion as you made perfume or magical potions, or collecting pebbles because they were your treasure. I think many of us did those sort of things without even thinking about it. And nobody told us how to play. Nobody's given us those specific instructions. We simply imagined. And I think, again, that's what loose parts are inviting children to do. They stop becoming the consumers of somebody else's ideas and creating their own. Instead of simply pressing a button to make something happen, children are becoming the people that make those things happen. It's giving them new skills that some other toys might not explore as much or give them as much opportunity to explore. They're learning to think creatively, to collaborate. They're learning to cope when something doesn't work. They're learning that there isn't always one answer and that people can have different ideas. And if I'm honest, those skills are becoming more important than ever because the world that our children are growing up in, we need people that can adapt, that can innovate and think differently. And loose parts are giving children opportunities to practice those skills in the earliest years. So problem solving in action. If you look to the picture that's on this screen, that is something that my young ones did quite a while ago now, actually. And they spent all morning and returned to it in the afternoon. And they had been positioning and collecting and using different parts from around the setting to create this. I'll be honest, it could easily be viewed as a mess, especially when you saw it spreading out and all the things being moved across the whole setting to create it. But one of the things that I find most fascinating about loose parts is children are becoming problem solvers, not because we tell them to, but because there are problems worth discovering and worth solving. And they'd made this setup and they collaborated together. There was 3 children that made this, and they were deeply, deeply engaged and immersed in this world that they were creating with various loose parts. They were talking through it. They were working together. They were collecting different things and deciding where things could go. They were planning. They were testing. They were adapting. And without anyone saying today's learning intention is resilience and critical thinking, that was exactly what they were developing as they explored. And I often think that's one of the most beautiful things about play. The learning isn't separate from the enjoyment. The learning happens because they're enjoying themselves. Psychologists sometimes talk about things called a productive struggle, and it's a moment where something is challenging enough to make us think, but not so difficult that we give up. And loose parts naturally create the opportunity in the moments because there isn't always one correct answer. Children are constantly testing ideas, refining them, and trying again. And I'd encourage us not to rush in too quickly. And sometimes that's really tempting, isn't it? Because we can all see when a tower is about to fall or why it keeps falling. We might know the answer to that. But if we come in and solve the problem for the child, we're also taking away the opportunity for them to solve it themselves. So perhaps the question becomes, do I need to step in or do I need to step back? research tells us. Now, I promise this won't start to feel like a lecture, so please don't worry. I'm not about to bombard you with loads of studies, but I do think it's reassuring that when what we're seeing in practice is also supported by research. Research like Simon Nicholson or Lev Vygotsky and many others have highlighted the importance of open-ended experiences, social interaction, and environments that can encourage children to think for themselves. When children engage with loose parts, we see creativity because there isn't the predetermined outcome. We're seeing executive functioning developing because children can plan, remember ideas, adapt strategies, and manage their attention. We're hearing rich language because children need to explain, negotiate, question, and collaborate. In other words, loose parts don't just support one area of development, they're supporting many areas simultaneously. And I think that's something really important to remember because sometimes people ask, well, what are they learning? But actually, I think a better question might be, what aren't they learning? Because when children are deeply engaged in that meaningful play, so many aspects of development are happening together simultaneously. So another misconception I sometimes hear is that loose parts are only really suitable for preschool children, and I couldn't disagree more. Loose parts grow with children. A baby might explore a basket of safe, carefully selected loose parts by looking and touching and grasping and mouthing appropriately, discovering different textures. A toddler might begin transporting them, filling and emptying containers or stacking and posting. And as children grow, some of the resources might become construction materials or storytelling props, um, mathematical manipulatives or scientific investigations, and immersive imaginative worlds. Now, the resources haven't changed, but the child has. And I think that's one of the resources that loose parts are such a sustainable investment because they continue offering you possibilities as children's thinking becomes more sophisticated. I also think it's a lovely reminder that there isn't a point when the imaginative play suddenly stops become valuable, it simply evolves. So we have loose parts throughout our setting here. Um, I have loose parts that are always accessible for the kitchen, that are always readily available for construction, and they can transport and use them. We have loose parts inside, we have loose parts outside, and we have always had that since my young ones, who some of them I've had at the moment in my current cohort since they were 8 months old, and they're about to go to school. And as soon as one starts school, they'll be turning 5. So they've had 4 years of continuous loose parts. Now, obviously, as they've got older, I have been able to introduce smaller loose parts that they couldn't have had when they were babies, because from a risk assessment and safety point of view, it wouldn't have been safe. But it's allowed them to explore that line of thinking and continually evolve with them. And as I mentioned previously, some of the wooden rings and the pine cones and the certain resources they've had consistently throughout that. And I've seen them used in so many different ways for each child. I also want to stop off and just make a point of saying that loose parts are incredibly important for reception and beyond, and I would love to see them incorporated more heavily within primary settings as well, because I have older children that come in here. I have my own children who still love using loose parts. And again, it's that open-ended resource that they can become whatever they want to be. That doesn't just stop when they hit 4 and start school. So I'd like us to spend a little time thinking about us as adults. Because if I'm honest, I think we are often the hardest part of loose parts, because it can feel incredibly tempting to direct, to demonstrate, to praise, to fix, to ask questions we already know the answer to. But when we start thinking about sustained shared thinking, it reminds us that our role isn't to dominate children's thinking, it's to extend it. So sometimes the most powerful phrase we can simply use is, I wonder. I wonder what would happen if. Tell me about your idea. How did you decide to do that? What have you noticed? Or what do you think you'll try next? These are the sorts of questions that don't test children, but they're inviting conversation. They're communicating something really important, that we are interested in their thinking. And when children feel that their ideas matter, they're much more likely to keep exploring. One thing I've learned over the years is that children rarely need us to provide all the answers. They just need adults who are genuinely curious to be there alongside them. I have to admit, this is probably a slide that I can find hardest in my own practice. Waiting, because we're busy and we want to help. Sometimes silence can feel uncomfortable. And sometimes we want to be in there with them. And I think, having been in this a long time, I've worked with people that have encouraged me and others to think we have to be there asking all the questions all the time. And I've learned that sometimes the richest moments can happen after we've resisted that urge to jump in, which can be quite tricky. Because have you ever watched a child pause and look at something, quietly think for a few seconds, and suddenly have a breakthrough? Now, if we'd spoken during those few seconds, that moment might never have happened, because children need thinking time just as much as they need the talking time. And sometimes they might be engrossed in something and have an idea, and we interrupt, albeit with good intentions, to give them our own idea, and then they lose their idea. So sometimes our presence is enough. We don't have to fill the silence. And perhaps one of the greatest gifts we can give children is time. So whenever I talk or deliver training on these parts, there are always a few questions that almost always come up. What if they throw them? What if it becomes messy? What if someone gets hurt? And they're all obviously completely valid questions. These parts do require thoughtful risk assessment. And I invite you all to obviously risk assess any loose parts that you're bringing into your own practice in your own settings. Obviously, some of that might need to be continual risk assessment at all times. But there's an important difference between a hazard and a risk. Hazard is something that's likely to cause harm, and a risk is an opportunity for children to learn to assess challenge safely. So you may have heard of this called as risk versus hazard. But what really helped me in my own practice was thinking of risk versus reward. So it's thinking about what the risk is and what the reward will be of a child exploring that. Now, there's some risks that are too great because the reward would be too small, and the risk can easily become a hazard. And there's other things that could have risk to it, and that's where we bring in that element of risky play, but the reward could be so much greater. And obviously we can try and minimize risks with certain things, but I think personally it's looking at that risk versus reward that's really helped me in my own practice. Our role isn't to remove every challenge, it's to remove unnecessary hazards whilst allowing children to develop judgment, confidence, and resilience. Because if children never experience manageable risk, how will they ever learn to assess it? Again, I think this is a big one that can come down to those larger loose parts and how you incorporate them, as well as those tiny ones that obviously might not be suitable for your cohort and things like that. But it comes a lot from the larger loose parts too. So loose parts and schemas. I just briefly like to touch on schemas because I genuinely think they're one of the missing pieces in the puzzle for many practitioners. Now, schemas are repeated patterns of behavior that help children to make sense of the world. And when you begin recognizing them, you can suddenly start to understand why children keep doing things, why one child is transporting everything, another's lining everything up, and why somebody keeps wrapping things while another's repeatedly building enclosures. Loose parts are wonderful and they go hand in hand with schematic play because they naturally support so many different schemas. Rather than expecting every child to use the same resource in the same way, they're allowing children to follow their own fascinations. Now, I'm only scratching the surface today because I know time is limited. But if schemas are something you'd like to explore further, I'll be delivering some dedicated webinars where we can really unpick them in more depth. I would like to begin to wrap up with something practical. So if you take nothing else away from today, perhaps there are 5 things that you could think about tomorrow morning. Firstly, look at your environment with fresh eyes. Secondly, trust children a little more than you did yesterday. Thirdly, ask one fewer question that has a right answer and one more question that begins with I wonder. Fourthly, you don't need to buy more. Start with what you've already got, what's naturally available to you. And finally, give yourself permission to step back because sometimes the richest learning happens when we're stopping trying to control it. I would just like to leave you with a final thought. Children don't actually need us to fill every moment. They don't need us to have all the answers. They don't need endless activities or expensive resources, but what they do need are opportunities, opportunities to imagine, to wonder, to fail, and to try again, and to solve problems that really matter to them. Loose parts don't teach children how to think. They're simply giving children the freedom to think for themselves. And personally, I think that's one of the greatest gifts we can offer. So tomorrow morning, before you walk past that cardboard tube or that basket of pine cones, I hope you'll pause just for a moment and ask yourself the same question that we've come back to throughout this webinar today. And that's, what could this become? Loose parts are simply about filling baskets with objects. They're about filling childhood with possibility because children don't need us to tell them what to think. They're simply needing environments that are inspiring them to think for themselves. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. It's been a real pleasure, and I'm delighted to answer any questions that you might have.